like any rugby player, I had my fair share of injuries, but the one that stands out and the one that actually ended my career at one point was a heart condition that I didn't even know I had up until I was 22. It's called a PFO. And what that is a very small hole in the heart. And unfortunately, in my case, it caused a lot of damage in my body to the point where I became partially blind. The medical term for it was a stroke. So I can say I had a stroke in my 20s, which is not something every person in their 20s can say. That was my biggest injury setback because it put my career to an end at the time. When it happened, I was told this is rugby is not something you're going to be able to pursue again. And that's an expected reply, given the state of my eyesight at the time. It was perfectly reasonable to hang up the boots. And what I learned during that period, James, is that movement and sport, being active, is just so critical to one's mental health.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Trauma, Training and Transformation, the space where we explore movement heals the mind. I'm Dr. James Alder, and today we're diving into a journey many people face, but very few talk about honestly, and that's rebuilding yourself after injury. This episode will explore how rehabilitation can evolve from restoring the body to restoring identity. Today, we have a really great friend, special guest, Mulcahy, an experienced coach, fleet rehabilitation specialist who transformed the setbacks of injury in his own journey and put it into structure, evidence-based approach to recovery. Mark has lived with this frustration, the fear and the slow climb back from injury into performance, and has turned that process into a powerful philosophy of physical and psychological healing. It's not just about exercise, progression or protocols. It's about patience, resilience, and how rebuilding the body can connect us both physically and mentally with who we are. So Mark, thank you for joining us today. And if you don't mind, just give a bit of background about yourself and where you are to the audience listening today.
Hey, James, thanks for having me. So I'm Mark Mulcahy, and I am living over in Dublin in Ireland, in a little seaside town called Skerries. And I have played rugby all around the world in Ireland, Canada and New Zealand. And I'm now working in a space where I'm helping individuals with joint pain to restore health and restore movement, like we're going to speak about today.
Thank you very much for sharing that, mate. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I got to work with you in Nova Scotia, exceptional rugby player. And it was always good to interact with you. You're also very mindful of the environment that you're in, and you're quite happy to share on the playing front any helpful advice and tips. And I can see why you've been very successful in your business. You've returned from injuries yourself. Some of them injuries probably would have ended another player's playing journey, but you worked through that rehabilitation and you've made it a program, and there was a turning point in that. So when did the recovery stop being a physical process and start becoming something more deeper, almost return to yourself through that journey?
Yeah, so for me, like any rugby player, I had my fair share of injuries, but the one that stands out and the one that actually ended my career at one point was a heart condition that I didn't even know I had up until I was 22. It's called a PFO. And what that is a very small hole in the heart. And unfortunately, in my case, it caused a lot of damage in my body to the point where I became partially blind. The medical term for it was a stroke. So I can say I had a stroke in my 20s, which is not something every person in their 20s can say. That was my biggest injury setback because it put my career to an end at the time. When it happened, I was told this is rugby is not something you're going to be able to pursue again. And that's an expected reply, given the state of my eyesight at the time. It was perfectly reasonable to hang up the boots. And what I learned during that period, James, is that movement and sport, being active, is just so critical to one's mental health. And I relied heavily on rugby as my outlet for that. And when that got taken away from me, I didn't have an easy time. Of course, there was the physical side of it. I was adapting to life now that I was partially blind, but the impact that this had mentally was the strongest. And yeah, it really does put your life on a different trajectory when you are injured. like anyone experiencing any type of injury, I was determined just to get to the bottom of it and see how I could get my life back on track. Because when you are in the top of your health and when things are going well, you don't necessarily appreciate it. But once those things get taken away from you, um, yeah, you really realize how important health and movement both are.
I really appreciate you sharing that with us today. I mean, that was very powerful. I mean, going through that experience at such a young age and then battling through that to still be able to, continue with your life is one thing in itself, but then to still be active later on into adulthood, that's a credit to you and your perseverance, your resilience. How did that journey happen? How did you overcome one challenge to then to be able to, find a way through that?
Yeah, so I'm very stubborn, and when I was sat down and told, "Look, Mark, you're not gonna be able to play rugby again." I was playing at a good level at that point. I had intentions of traveling over to Canada, and I was frustrated at the time because we had just come out of COVID, and yeah, like it was almost as if rugby was getting started again, and then it had to stop for me. But it wasn't stopping for a couple of years. This time, it was stopping for good, and as I said, I was stubborn and I said, I'll take time off rugby, but I knew in my heart that eventually I wanted to get back out there. And it seemed like such an impossible challenge at the time due to the fact that I was partially blind now. But I said to myself, I would start at whatever level I had to in order to just build up the confidence again. Because I think that goes for any type of injury or any type of trauma someone experiences. You just need to build up their confidence gradually. And I was willing to go through that process and I understood that much. Yeah, I didn't know how long it was going to take. I didn't know if it would ever work out, but yeah, it definitely drove me to use parts of my mentality that I didn't even realize I had, if that makes sense. Because when you don't experience these things in your life, you never have to use them. When you don't get put into a corner, you don't have to fight. In a way, it was a blessing in disguise because I got to discover a lot about myself that I wouldn't have discovered previously if it didn't happen.
No, and that's incredible. And it sounds like that sense of resilience in them to overcome those challenges. Those injuries stripped away that level of momentum that you was building, right? That identity, that rugby community that held dear to you. So that suddenly that discipline of that environment that once drove you to be competitive almost felt like pressure. Could you get back? Was it a possible, or was it punishment? Was you punishing yourself to get through to that level? But as you rightly said, your own personal stubbornness wouldn't allow you to fail. So how did you start that that shift of, is this really a barrier, or can I turn this into rehab and make it more, instead of restrictive, more of an healing process so that I can overcome this hurdle?
So, with the support of others, I was able to come to the conclusion that just because you have a label doesn't necessarily mean you have to abide by that label. I always think about how my my tests, whenever I get my eyes tested, they don't align with the things I am able to do now. And I suppose that is the real lesson of it all. And I think it correlates very well with the message you're conveying. It's that a label doesn't dictate you. Like, I'm partially blind, but by no means does it impact my life anymore because I decided that's not going to be the case for me. And it's what I see all the time with the individuals I work with. They may have been given a term to describe the issue going on, such as arthritis or tendonitis, for example, which is a very common one for the knees. And it's very common to get these labels and then think that it's a life sentence as opposed to an opportunity. Of course, at the time, I definitely saw my own struggle as a punishment, but in time, I was able to see it as a blessing. The reason for that is because, as I said, I got to experience things I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. But more importantly, I've been able to use that experience and help others who are going through the same thing. So, yeah, like I'll just give you an example. It can be difficult when you're in an environment of people, and we all have these thoughts. Like if somebody is blind, for example, in my case, you're not going to assume they're going to be the best rugby player on the field. If someone has another form of disability, you're going to have certain presumptions about them. So for me, I really had to figure out my own way of navigating that, and One thing you later discovered was that I didn't tell my coaches. So I did get back training for rugby. I did get back playing, and I didn't actually tell my coaches that I was partially blind because I felt they would view me differently. And because it was all so new to me, I didn't have a better approach to do it. Perhaps if it happened to me now that I'm a little bit wiser and older, might have approached it differently. Um, but at the time, I felt I didn't want selections to go against me, or I didn't want to be viewed in a different light. So when I arrived over in Nova Scotia and I met you and all our other friends over there, I just decided I'm going to keep this one to myself because I just want to be seen as Mark. I don't want to be seen as Mark the blind guy.
No, listen, mate. I mean, that's powerful. Again, just sharing that experience. And you're right. I think people are walking around with labels and they carry quite heavy, right? The stigma around that label being associated with you. I'm going to attest, I'm very fortunate to work with you in Nova Scotia. You played for the Nova Scotia senior Celtics team and also represented the Atlantic Privateers, and you were an exceptional rugby player. I could see why you could go on to, bigger and better things in your playing career. And you mentioned there about, your eyesight and it being not necessarily, something that impacted you and stopped you playing, but it was something that affected you day to day. And you was worried about that impact on your selection and are you going to get involved in the game still and would it be used against you? There was a very famous rugby league player, Barry McDermott, who played for
Yes.
Wigan and Leeds. He talked quite openly about the stigma, highlighted about his lack of eyesight in one eye, and would it stop him? Would it be a barrier to selection? And I think, like you, he overcome that by his performances and his true ability as a rugby player. So every credit to you, mate. I think anyone who's listening can only be warmed by you sharing that experience, and anyone out there who may be suffering with similar kind of concerns, living your experience, you can see that there's a potential there for them to still achieve all their goals and aspirations in sports by just trusting themselves and being purposeful and being stubborn like yourself. But there's nothing wrong with that. Now you talk about rehab being a form of therapy. But it's not just muscles, right? You talk about joints, but also the mind. How does that relationship? When do you first realize that rebuilding physically, you've also got to tap into the mental state of your clients? Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the episode content, hit subscribe, leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. It only takes 10 seconds and really helps to grow my podcast.
Yeah, so to answer that question, I'm just going to tag on to something you brought up there, which is Barry McDermott. And
Yes.
for me, he was somewhat of a role model. Although I never met the man, I've only read books of his. Um, he is someone who did what I wanted to do. I think that's a very simple idea, but it's a very powerful one as well. If someone has done what you would like to do, that's all the more evidence that you can do it too. So that extends to any condition. If someone is perhaps in an area that I know you have experienced a lot of people who have PTSD, for example, and their recovery journey. It's important for those people to see other people who are making progress along those lines. And I was no different, and I seeked out those people. So, um, I researched like a madman to find rugby players or any individuals who have had the same heart condition as I did. I eventually developed knee injuries. I've had a lot of hip injuries over the years, and simply knowing that they could be overcome was very, very powerful for me. And just on the topic of eyesight, I wouldn't have been able to express my story if it wasn't for another individual named Ian McKinley. So I'm a friend of Ian's now, and I might get this wrong, but he has somewhere between 6 and 9 caps for Italy. He's an Irish man, but he played for Italy through the residence rule, and he's like me, he's partially blind. And I remember being in Canada. I was told I'd never play rugby again, and I was feeling sorry for myself. And I remember my dad sent over a copy of Ian's book to me with a friend who was coming over to visit me. And as soon as I read that book, my whole approach changed, and I realized that I could do it. And I just think it's so important to have a role model because otherwise it just seems impossible. So we spoke about, yeah, of course, it can be physically done, but if you don't have the evidence and you don't have someone in front of you who's done it before, it can be very difficult to see that.
No, very much so. I mean, we all have role models for different reasons, don't we? You go through your experience to talk about Ian, and by just being aware of his journey, there's familiarity there because you've lived that experience. You know, Barry McDermott, I bring him up because I'm a Wigan lad. He played for Wigan, and I used to watch him from the terraces. And such a strong running player, big guy, someone having that disability of eyesight, it shows that that's possible. I look at my role models, as I said, I'm from Wigan, and on the rugby side of things, I look at Sean Edwards, Wigan lad doing good, just decorated rugby league players to now being successful in Union, and now Andy Farrell, he said quite famously on the rugby podcast, once a Wiganer, always a Wiganer, and you can't hide that. So it's very difficult, but it's good to have role models. But someone in your position where you've had that lived experience, you know that you've overcome something quite big. And you should be proud of that, mate, But how do you use that purpose action in your rehab work? How do you transfer that in your delivery of message with your clients?
Yeah, so one thing to understand is, of course, I had pretty uncommon set of circumstances, but each individual I work with, they're going through their own version of that. So it's a strength of mine to be able to understand where they're coming from and just to be able to meet them there. Because you know yourself, if you're injured and if you're going through it, it just feels like you're all alone out there. And without someone to support you and give you a slap on the back when you need it, perhaps you don't overcome certain circumstances. So that's become my mission now, because it's all well and good me being able to tell my story here, but I often think about how many others have gone action and at a gradual decline from hearing or discovering certain things or being diagnosed with certain conditions. So I'm very passionate about using it as an opportunity to overcome, as opposed to letting it overcome you.
So use it as a positive in a sense. You're not letting it hold you back, pushing through that envelope to get on the other side. Do you see that same purpose, same sense of want to succeed in your clients?
Yeah, and it's very funny because if you didn't have things like discipline, or if you didn't have the ability to follow a training program right to the end, the mere act of doing that, you don't just use that once, you use that for the rest of your life. And it's like the two of us growing up playing rugby. Like, I think because we've done it since we were young lads, we sometimes take for granted how consistent you need to be to turn up on a Tuesday, a Thursday, and a Saturday, and how that really serves you. Because then when it comes to other things like university, you're able just to show up and do the work. Or work, when you go into the workplace, you're just able to show up. Or if you know, when I first started my business, I really had to knuckle down and do a lot of work. And because I was all on my own at the beginning, I yeah, the workload was huge. Because I had those experiences of just being able to knuckle down and work hard behind me. It really served me. And I feel that's just an added benefit of going through a journey to overcome an injury, because you don't just get to the point where you feel like the injury never happened, which is the goal of individuals who I work with. But you achieve something even greater, which is this discipline, which is realizing that you're way more able than you thought you were. A lot of the individuals who come to me have had previous experiences of believing that their issues cannot be resolved. And the mere act of seeing the other side of it and experiencing the other side of it opens their mind up to more possibilities. So I think that is the most rewarding thing beyond actually getting out of pain.
You've had complex health issues alongside injury, which compounds that experience for you. Do you feel like you're then best placed to share that experience when covering these rehabilitation programs? Because you can put lived experience to both theory and practice.
Absolutely, because I have my own experiences, but at the same time, I'm a huge advocate of lifelong learning. And as much as I know, I'm curious about what I don't know as well. That's why that's why I just love gaining more experiences and being able to lean on previous experiences, because I know for a fact if someone comes to me, I'm not going to know their situation inside out. Yes, of course, I'm going to have gone through my own version, but my aim then is to sometimes get out of my own way and try to understand things from their perspective. Because if I'm always seeing things from my perspective, perhaps I'm never going to get the full picture. And the more you can get someone else's full picture and you can understand them deeply, that's when you can influence someone. And if you can influence someone, you can get them the result they're looking for. I'm sure you're the same, James. You resonate with the people who understand you the most. It's always a priority of mine to understand those who I work with, simply because if they're not understood, if you can't understand them, they're not going to feel understood. And if they're not going to feel understood, it's going to be very difficult for them to get the results. So yes, I will know what they're going through to an extent, but people come to me for different injuries. People come to me from different walks of life. You really want to give them the time and space they need to be understood. And that applies across the block. You know, if somebody was recovering from another kind of illness, you want to understand them, because it's a lonely place when you're not feeling understood. And the most powerful thing you can give someone is the attention. Do you? I hear where you're coming from. I think it's the most powerful thing.
Well, most definitely, mate. And I do really appreciate you sharing that, because I think one of the reasons and purpose behind this podcast was, it's everything's in the title, trauma. It could be any elevation of trauma. No trauma is less impactful on the individual than their lived experience, be it recovering from injury, losing the ability to play sport because of the injury, or just a life-changing experience. You go through a transformation, sometimes not always for the positive, and it's how we can utilize movement, any form of movement, and in this way, the use of rehabilitation techniques. And when I started this podcast, one of the first things I wanted to do was connect with you again and get you on, because I think you come to this from a unique perspective, lived experience, theory, with evidence-backed approach and practical knowledge that you can tie all these things together and sharing that knowledge with our audience today, but more importantly, your clients that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, can only improve that mental journey. So in relation to the growth and the recovery on the physical element, do you recognize the improvements mentally, seeing that they can actually overcome these barriers and these hurdles?
Yeah, and I'll give you just an example that illustrates that. So I had a client over in Denver, Colorado, and he had knee issues for 10 years. And when it's been going on for that long, something like knee pain actually becomes part of your identity. So you don't see the world as anything other than a place where you have knee pain. It's difficult for you to see anything else. So even though he began making progress within our first 4 weeks working together, he almost felt like it's only a matter of time before I'm back there. So yeah, I'm sure you've seen it across different disciplines, but I remember that story particularly because it wasn't just about him recovering physically, which he did due to his consistency and due to his seeking of feedback. So these are all very important elements, and because he was able to do that, and because he was able to stay consistent with it, again, he got something much greater than his knees back. He was able to get to a place where he trusted himself again. He wasn't second guessing himself. He was able to go for runs. He was able to cycle without thinking his knee is going to blow. And of course, that's just what happens, and that's just the process. And like I said, everyone is going to come at it from a different perspective. That was just his. And through knowing that and through understanding that, I was just able to work with him and say, listen, like the goal isn't to fully trust your knee straight away. The goal is to trust it a little more each time. Don't expect it all happening straight away. Just trust it a little more each time. And yeah, that same guy, he's at a place now where he's running very, very well, Alexander. Yeah, he couldn't be happier, but he's developed a mentality where he's happy where he's at, but he wants to keep going. And I think that is something that distinguishes someone who like comes in and gets their knee back, to someone who wants to create a lifestyle change. And he's certainly a very good example of that. So
And that's great to hear, especially for your client who's overcome those very big challenges. But that taps into also his identity, because like you said, it becomes a lived lifestyle that's part and parcel of the current identity, not what they once were. And you have to challenge that to become better, right? And that's what you've done through your treatment with him and your perseverance and his perseverance to get to was an healthy and athlete now, which is a huge journey. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. And yeah, like your own journey is personal. Whether you just want to walk the dog without pain, or you want to go over and get coached by James Elder in Nova Scotia and play for the Celtics, it doesn't matter. Your own journey is individual. So whatever is important to you, it might be different to the next person. But yeah, each individual journey is different.
No, completely. And I touch into mine really. Very big into running, part of rugby also, but also my old job. And back in the day, you get a bit of a calf strain, Achilles issue, twisted ankle, that kind of thing. A few ibuprofen, and you're good to go because you had to be fit. You couldn't see injury as a weakness, so you had to overcome them. And I'd wished I'd have known you back then. Yes, you could have done physio treatment, that kind of stuff, but it's just that self-reinforcement that, listen to your body. Your body's, it needs to be healthy. You've got to be in here healthy, but your body's going to be, they're going to be in connection.
Mhm.
And if I had had you back in the day, then I would have overcome those injuries with a little bit more positive approach rather than thinking, oh, I can't say I'm hurt because that's just weakness. You'll have people out there who are suffering with some form of injury that mentally they won't accept or won't be willing to go and get support. How could you help them?
Yeah, so the first thing to do is just get your quickest win under your belt, because if you've been in a cycle where things haven't been going your way, the most important thing for that individual is to get their first win under their belt. And it almost sets up a cycle of momentum. And once you have that, you can't see a different outcome than the one you're experiencing until you see evidence of the contrary. That will be my simple suggestion. Just get your first win under your belt, which can be easier said than done. But at the same time, it does set up that feedback loop. And if you continue down that tread, right, that's when life-changing results can happen. Yeah, for that individual, it can be difficult because it requires a sense of openness to even have the thought in your mind to get that first win. But yeah, I think it can be very difficult in this day and age. There's everyone's promising solutions, and there's a lot of people who are very good at their jobs, but there's also a lot of contradicting opinions on things. So that can ultimately come at the detriment of the people you're trying to help. Everyone's trying to be very, very helpful to the point where the person who needs to be helped is just confused. Yeah, it's important to get your first win, but be in an environment where you're supported to do so. And that's why I love working with people in a one-on-one capacity. It's because I just get to be there and support them. Because otherwise they're going to be getting varying opinions from others, and it leads to not a lot of work being done and a lot of confusion. So support is one thing, but then on top of that, getting your first win under the belt.
And that's huge. You're right. I mean, it's, the first step, be it in movement or first step towards recovery, could be in the way of getting rehabilitation, or it could be some form of physical activity. It's all positive because you're taking that active step to do something.
Yeah.
Now, I know you are very big in research, and you use research to inform yourself to be better so you can give the best product for your clients. And one of the books that you're very keen on, and you mentioned this really early on, and I think we posted about this just recently, is about cybernetics, a
Yes.
book that you all quite dear. Can you just tell the listeners about it and how that's informed and framed your philosophy?
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about cybernetics. I've even said to my dad at one point, I think that should be on the curriculum at schools. I feel very passionately about that book in particular, largely because it had a big impact on me. When I was 19, I was over in New Zealand, and I was playing rugby, and it was my biggest rugby opportunity to date at that point. I felt like a small fish, to be honest, amongst a lot of big fish over there. There were people in the Crusaders Academy. There were people from countries all over the world there in Christchurch to play rugby. And the one thing that I got from that experience was I just knew I needed to lift my confidence. And I had the exact same capability as all these people, but because I wasn't there to like credit myself, it wasn't manifesting in my playing, it wasn't manifesting in my behaviors. And what cybernetics does that I love about it is it takes what we know of self-improvement and makes it very accessible. You know, oftentimes that term self-improvement is affiliated with meditating in a field or in a cave. And I just think thinking is a skill that we should all be looking to master. If you have any goals and you have any desire to get better at anything, what actually happens throughout that process is your thinking about that thing changes. And we've never actually been taught how to think. So I think it's pretty common for most people to assume that the way they think is the way it has to be. But the thing psycho-cybernetics did for me was completely just change how I looked at thinking and said, oh, like thinking is a skill, like playing tennis is a skill, or playing rugby is a skill, or play skiing is a skill. And if you can develop some of those skills in your favor, you're not only going to achieve worthwhile results, but your daily life is going to be a lot more pleasant. And that's what we're after, James. It's never about kicking 7 out of 7 in your kicking goals, beating the Royal British Navy in a game for Atlantic Selects. It's never about that. It's about how you feel when you do it. And if you're happy in the process. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing unless I was to be happy doing so. I don't think anything is worth sacrificing that for. And I think psycho-cybernetics just teaches you how to do that. And I think if you're working with individuals as well, you need to know where they're coming from. And if you were to bring on people I've worked with previously, they might not know it, but there's lessons I learned through reading psycho-cybernetics that are just laced into my program and in my rehab. So it really impacts every area of my life. And I could go on about psycho-cybernetics for a long time. We could do a separate podcast on it if you like. But the thing about psycho-cybernetics, it teaches you how to think in an effective way. And if you're thinking more effectively, you're living more effectively.
Well, very much so. The reason I bring the book up because I remember seeing the post that you put out there, and
Yes.
as an academic, I'm always like you, searching for knowledge, always want to improve what I know, and also find out what I don't know. And what I found, I've only just started reading the book. Psycho-Cybernetics is a great book. It's really interesting, even as a excitable read, and it can only help. But another book I would put alongside it is The Chimp Paradox. You know, the Chimp Paradox allows us to understand a little bit about who we are, why we do things. And I think that alongside psycho-cybernetics, we can then find out who we are and then use the positive tools to then make correct decisions going forward. And it's having that knowledge and sharing that knowledge can only be better for everybody, really. Especially in your environment where you're dealing with clients day in, day out, positively reinforcing your clients that this rehab could be a long journey, to stick to it. So what positive messages do you use with clients or when you're trying to share the message about your rehabilitation techniques?
From psycho-cybernetics to answer this question, and it's called, I can't recall the chapter, I'm not that familiar with it, although I've read it several times at this point, but the study showed a series of students were in a classroom and they were told by the conductor of the test they were going to do that you're going to do this test. It's going to take you a certain amount of time. We're going to ring a bell at some point during this test. And what that bell is going to indicate is when the average person finishes up the test. So the students went about their tests and they were doing well. And the conductor of the test deliberately rang the bell very, very early in order for them to recognize, okay, this is when the average man's time is up. So the average man has finished his test at this point, and I'm only halfway through. So this is what happened. The conductor of the research, the conductor of the test rang the bell, and up until that point, the students were performing well. But then what was noticed, because they were measuring they're measuring a series of things, but the most important thing they noticed is that their performance dipped. Once they realized they were operating at the below average level, their performance was completely deteriorated, and visible signs of frustration began to arise. Some of them were excessively sweating. And I may get some of the details wrong, but the concept is that when you feel you're operating at that below average level, your performance dips, whether that's in a rugby game or whether that's in rehabilitation or whether that's with anything. If you don't feel you're cooking a meal to the standard that you set for yourself, you're going to feel somewhat inferior because of that. And one thing I see constantly coming up with the individuals I work with, and it's something I went through myself, James, just thinking I wasn't as good as the expectation I've set for myself. So when a client wants something to happen really quickly, they don't think they're performing well, but they are, it's just important to be there to remind them, look, you're on track. You're doing really well. You might think you're below this average line or you're underperforming, but no, you're really performing well here. You're doing well. Look at your results. It's always good to have tangible measurements to point back to whenever those moments arise. I think that's an important element. Just keep your expectations in check, because most humans are going to have high expectations. I think high expectations is a great thing to have, but when you're not hitting those expectations, it can almost like damage your performance. So having a healthy relationship with expectations is something I always prioritize.
That's amazing, mate. So the use of cybernetics has helped you to galvanize your delivery in a sense, because it's a part and parcel of you. It's informed you, so then you can inform others, right?
Yeah, and
Especially
I'll just
around.
tag on to that, James, that when I was learning how to play rugby with a visual disability, I had to really bring my expectations down. I didn't start playing at a very good level. I started playing at any level and I worked my way up from there. In fact, I began playing touch rugby in Canada, and then I gradually got good at that. Yeah, I wasn't very, very good at the beginning. I just had to learn, but there was no way I would have continued on that track if I were just constantly critical of myself. So I really reset my expectations and I said, look, if I can do a little bit better than I did the last day, if I can get a few more touches here, and if I'm recognizing things that I didn't do the last time that I'm doing more of this time, then they're wins. And as long as I'm getting little wins each time and the bar is moving a little bit beyond where it was last week, then that's all I can ask for. I think when you make these massive jumps and you expect massive changes from where you were last week or last month, you can be disappointed. And look, as I said, it's good to have high standards, but keep them in check. Have a good relationship with your expectations, and it's going to make for a more enjoyable process. They're very much lessons I learned myself. It's the same with when you start a business or when you start a podcast. Things aren't going to happen straight away, but so long as your statistics are moving in the right direction, so long as you're feeling more confident presenting, often they're not things you can measure, but sometimes you just know. And having a good relationship with that and knowing the signs to look out for, they can just keep you going. And like you said, it's just important to keep going. It's important to stick with it. And the main reason someone isn't going to stick with someone is because they're not feeling as if they're making enough progress. So that's something I always go back to, and it's something I learned from cybernetics, like you mentioned.
That's great messaging, especially, I mean, for myself, I feel really warm listening to that approach to not just about you as a person, but how it's informed you in the way that you look at things and how you deliver the message to your clients. You're looking at refocusing them by using imagery as a positive tool. And then hopefully that will connect to them and improve their self-efficacy, their confidence, see their identity evolve through the use of your techniques. Gives them that belief, right? And it also, hopefully, through that practice, they'll see their positivity and their mind shift go in the right direction, you know. But do you see yourself at times having to reinforce that, rewarding your clients or reminding them to reward themselves because of the journey they're on?
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it be with the clients or whether it be with myself or whether it be with my friends, it's a universal thing. And I love the way you phrase that, because I think it is important to reward the wins. I think given the way we were schooled and given the way perhaps you'll know yourself being from Wigan and growing up in those rugby environments, we tend to be very critical of ourselves. Once again, it's not always a bad thing. I think it's important to have that. But if you don't feel you're winning, if you don't feel you're progressing, you're not going to stick at something for very long. So I'm always reminded, it might seem very egocentric, but if I'm working towards a goal and I do the smallest thing to indicate that I'm making progress, I make sure to make a mental note of it and say, you did that well. Of course, I'm looking for the things I'm not doing so well as well, so we can learn. But it's important to take note of the things you're doing well, just so you know you're on track.
Very much so. I mean, this for me is a massive learning experience. It's very different talking via a podcast than it is on a rugby field talking to rugby players
Yeah.
or in front of students in a classroom. It's different, and I would argue probably for me this is more challenging because I'm going to talk to a great guest like yourself, and then this is going to go out so everyone can see it.
Yeah.
Coaching or teaching is for that moment in time. and then no one else sees it again. So it's, it's something to overcome, but I'm excited by the challenge. I'm wanting to learn, and I'm learning a lot. Just I'm sharing this experience with you, Mark, because of some of the experience that you lived growing up, the challenges that you face. I know for a fact there'll be people listening to the podcast when it goes live that they'll have shared that experience, and they're probably using you as a if you don't mind me saying, as a role model themselves to know that they can overcome these barriers, especially in athletic competition.
And one thing I'll say about that relates very much to psycho-cybernetics. And the whole message of the book says something along the lines of, if you can imagine, worry, or tie your lace, you can be successful. So I think you can use your experiences with teaching people or coaching or rugby and use that for your betterment when it comes to hosting podcasts. It's all interlinked. And if you can be successful in one area, you can be successful in another. So again, I'm going to expose my egocentric self here, but I remember playing a game in rainy weather over in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was us in a local derby against Halifax OFC, and I remember hitting a drop goal in that game. I haven't hit many drop goals throughout my career, but I always recall that because it was a wet day and it wasn't from a huge distance out, but it's difficult to get them on the money when it's pouring down in a wet Nova Scotia day like that. And I think you need moments like that just to recall whenever you're going through it and whenever you need a little bit of encouragement. It's like a squirrel gathering chestnuts. You need like these moments to draw on sure if you're going through a process. Because it just shows like what that drop goal didn't happen there and then. That drop goal happened as a result of me doing it 100, 200 times, 300 times for years in the park before that. In training, perhaps missing them, perhaps getting them wrong, and realizing what I need to do to actually get it right, which thankfully I did that day in Halifax in the local derby. But yeah, just to circle back to my point, I think you teaching in a classroom, you coaching rugby, and you being on a podcast, they're all getting the reps in and they're all developing you as a person. And yeah, you ultimately become the person over time, so long as you stick with it.
Yeah, very powerful, mate. And I do appreciate you sharing that. So we're going to have clients that you see, and we're going to have people in the audience listen to this. What would be your message to any individual who's suffering through injury, suffering through illness, and need to find the help they need, some form of rehabilitation? Just equally, they've got to move. So what would your messages be to them? What should they do tomorrow?
Great question, James. So we would have to go back to just getting one win under your belt. Once you set up that positive reinforcement, and once you develop that momentum, it can be very difficult to stop. Again, it doesn't have to be a crazy big win. It just has to be a step in the right direction. It can be an inch step, and then you'll make a 2 inch step the next day or the next week. Just making sure it's moving in the right direction. It doesn't matter how long it takes, because as you know, the journey is not the destination. The journey is the process. And for me, it was never about having credentials and having certain status symbols. It was never about that. It was always the person that I wanted to become in the process. So that's also a very important question to ask yourself. Like, what kind of person do you want to become? What kind of person has the thing that you want? Once you can get a clear idea of that, and having role models, which is something I touched on earlier, they can provide the evidence that it can be done. So if you're stacking all these positives in your favor, and if we're even going to circle back to what I just mentioned about the squirrel having chestnuts of good moments, you don't need to be successful in the area you're looking to be successful in order to, like, let's say, for example, it's I've never succeeded in this area before, therefore I can't do it. It's not really applicable. If you've done well in another area, the flames naturally cross over into other areas. So, like I used drop goal, like I might be thinking about that drop goal that I kicked, and that's going to fuel me into better presenting, better communication with the people I work with, better marketing, better communication with my loved ones. You might think, what do drop goals and communication have in common, or rehabilitation? But it has everything in common, because what it does is set your mentality in the right direction. And I think that's why I keep circling back to it. I wish I had another answer, but it all goes back to getting that first win under a belt.
I appreciate that, mate. Thank you. I mean, every individual out there will have their own setbacks, and it could be a physical setback, but it's definitely going to have an impact on your mental state, because if it doesn't impact your identity, it'll definitely impact
Yeah.
your ability to overcome that challenge, right?
Yeah.
So I do appreciate you sharing that. I mean, so that being said, Mark, everyone's waiting to hear. Where did we find out where you are? Where did we find your services and your support?
Ensure to give you all the links to my social media for the show notes, or however you organize that. But the people who can benefit from anything I do are people who have done everything they think they can do to resolve knee pain, back pain, foot pain, hip pain, and everything they seem to try just hasn't been working. They're still frustrated. They still don't trust themselves going upstairs, or they can't do things like running, things they used to love. So what I would do with an individual in this situation is bring them bring them through what I call a one-to-one rebuild. And what that does is just get to the root cause of their pain and get them feeling so confident to the point where they feel like the injury never happened. And I regularly put up social media posts about that. I'm going to have a lot of content coming very, very soon. I am in the process of bringing in the last 6 people into my program on November 28th. The reason we're kicking off on November 28th was because I feel, based on anyone who came in this year, they're all making noticeable progress within 4 weeks. So if you start on 20th of November, you'll be going into the new year already living out resolutions others are promising themselves to start. The reason I'm only bringing on 6 individuals this time around goes back to what we spoke about in our conversation, which is the support element. And I'm already working with my current set of clients. And in order to maintain the support, which I feel is the most important element of my program, I need to be able to give the individual my attention. Hence why I'm only bringing on 6 people this time around. But I will be opening more space in the new year, and I'm always bringing on people in 2-month, 3-month increments. So if you don't get a space this time around, not to worry, there will be spaces opening in the new year. But in the meantime, you can find me on all the major social medias. And yeah, at some stage, I imagine I'll be back on this podcast.
No, that's amazing, mate. Thank you. I love the posts that you put on social media. Informative, fun. I never go away with them not knowing what I need to do, or want to wait for the next one. It's it's great to see an individual overcome so many hurdles that they've had to face in their own personal and professional life, but not just overcome them, share them, and then use it as a positive tool for people out there who may not necessarily have the same journey as you, but have physical issues that they need to overcome that definitely have an impact on their mental well-being. And by hopefully contacting you, they'll be able to do that. And I just want to reassure the listeners that all contact details for Mark will be in the description box below. And please reach out to him. I'm sure he can give you the advice. If he can't get you a place this time, definitely in the future, it's only going to be beneficial for your overall physical and mental well-being. I do appreciate your time on that, Mark, today. And I hope you get as many clients as possible, mate, so that you can share your experience and help these people move forward in their lives.
Of course, James. And thanks a million for having me. I really enjoy catching up.
It's always a really positive time listening to you. I can't wait for you to grow and grow with your own business. Everybody out there suffering with any form of physical and mental injury, just remember there's people out there for you. You don't have to suffer alone. People will be there to support you in whatever situation you need. Today, this has been Trauma Training Transformation. I'm Dr. James Alder. No exercise is too big and no exercise is too small. Rehab starts whenever you need it. Always reach out to professionals if you need to. Mert being a prime example, and I hope a lot of you contact him after this. If this episode resonates with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing starts with a smaller step. Today, you've been listening to Trauma Training and Transformation. You can find this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. Please watch, like, share, and subscribe. You can also find the video on my YouTube channel, James Alder 003. I also provide a Substack newsletter on transformation through training. That's where I share some helpful tips in physical and mental well-being that you can share for yourself and share with your friends. If you would like to support my channel, you can buy me a coffee and the link is below in the description. Your support keeps this conversation growing and keeps me connected to this community. Thanks for listening. Remember, every rep counts, but the first one always starts in the mind. I'm Dr. James Alder. Thank you for joining us today and listening to Trauma, Training, Transformation, Exploring a Movement Heals the Mind.